Hi Nat5, so we are still on Life on Earth. We're looking at food production and in particular how fertilisers impact on the environment. So we have to start with what a fertiliser is, and basically that's anything that increases plant growth, okay, anything that makes a plant grow better. And what we're looking for there then is something that contains the nutrients that plants need, because you're trying to enrich the soil and make sure that you've got enough of what they need. So we could have natural fertilisers or man-made. The natural is kind of, you could have compost, which is the plant kind of versions of. We have the potential other kind of manure levels. What we have here is nitrogenous waste. So that means there's lots of nitrogen in here and other chemicals. But basically, if it came from something that was alive, you assume that there must be the nutrients that living things need in it. Okay, and we also can have things that look a little bit nicer. We can have the man-made version where we have picked exactly what chemicals we need and it's just those chemicals. Okay, so the main nutrients that you need to know are nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. Particularly you would write them as NPK because that's the chemical element symbols. And the reason that we're looking for NPK is because these are the main, what we call macronutrients, the main ones they need. So if nitrogen you need for everything, but if you don't have enough nitrogen, then basically the leaves are rubbish and nothing's working well for them. Potassium in particular is good for just leaf growth and generally doing well, and phosphorus for the roots. So what you get in fertilizers is this ratio written in terms of NPK. Okay, how much nitrogen to how much phosphorus to how much potassium. Okay, and you'll notice that in this one there's 0 potassium, and that's obviously because you would only use, well, not obviously, but you should think this through, you would use this one where you had a soil that was already rich in potassium, or with plants who were not that needy of it, because you only want to put in what you need. You don't want to overdo it, and you want to make sure that you're giving exactly what you need. So if you have a soil which is very low in nitrogen, then you might look at this one and say, well, actually this one has got a very high ratio of nitrogen to your phosphorus to potassium, will double. Okay, so you could be asked to do problem solving on this. You could be asked to cancel down to it being just the simplest whole number ratio. That's the most likely thing that I think you're going to see for NPK. So the problem with fertilizers is that they make things grow, which is also why we need them. But if they're making things grow where we don't want them, then that's a problem. Okay, so we need to get them into the plants, and to get them into the plants we need to put them in water in the roots. But if it's in water, that means that the water might not stay in the soil because water moves through the soil. So this is called leaching, and it's a particular problem with fertilizers. So first problem, you lose your fertilizer, and that means that all the money that you've put into buying the fertilizer doesn't get into the crop. Secondly, if that fertilizer gets somewhere else, then it can make things grow where you don't want them to grow. And in particular, you need to know about what happens if it gets into water courses. So what you have is something called eutrophication. So in a normal river, pond and lake, whatever, any water course, you have a balance between the plant life and the animal life. So the plants are happily taking in light, making oxygen, which is oxygenating the water, and animals are feeding off them, and it's just all balanced. Okay, there's a nice kind of setup of an ecosystem in there. But fertilizers can tip that balance, so the plants basically take over. And what you end up with is a process called eutrophication. Okay, it's actually a natural thing, but it normally takes a very, very long time for this to happen. What you'll normally see is an algal bloom, so this kind of greenness spreading. Okay, so here we have a setup for what's happening with eutrophication. So this is what's happening over time. So first of all, what we get is excess nutrients. This is the fertilizers are flushed into the river. And so now we have a ton of what plants need. And the plants that grow fastest are single-celled plants, algae. And so the algae start to grow really, really fast. And that's great for them. But what's happening now is that they are blocking all of the light. So the algal bloom takes over the whole of the surface, meaning that all the plants down the bottom are now no longer getting any light. They start dying off. Okay, and as they're dying, that means that the oxygen that they were producing is no longer being produced, so that's starting to drop down the oxygen level. Okay, at the same time, we now have dead stuff down here. We've got nutrients for bacteria and fungi that normally break this stuff down, so they start feeding on that and increasing in numbers and decreasing the oxygen, and eventually that means that we're going to get no oxygen that will support other organisms, so everything else dies off. And that's what we mean by eutrophication. Okay, so follow through. Fertilizers leach into the water, so you've now got a high level of nutrition for plants, so there's an algal bloom. The algal bloom blocks out light, that means other plants die. Also, I would have to say algae are a very short-lived species overall. They tend to be kind of multiplying in there and dying quite quickly, so you're going to get some algae that are also increasing the waste inside the water. So now you've got dead plants, dead algae, and now you've got food for decomposers, the bacteria and fungi. Okay, the increased bacteria use up all the oxygen, and also you've got less plants making oxygen, and our falling oxygen means that everything else dies off. So you get some pretty kind of gross versions of this. In particular, they can look quite spectacular with these kind of red algal blooms. But these are generally not very nice things. Quite often the red algal blooms are toxic, and you can get basically the result a huge number of dead fish and other animals. It's not just fertilizers. There are lots and lots of different ways that you can get nutrients that you don't necessarily need into the water. So anything that's upping your big ones, so your N, your P or your K, is going to bump up the amount of plant growth that you've got inside a water system. So you've got to ask, is there an alternative? Could you avoid using an excess amount of fertilizers? So you could go kind of old school on this one, but very effective. What you do is you just leave your fields for certain years with specific crops. So what happens here is certain crops need certain things. So if you take, say, a leafy crop, okay, 1 year, then in that year, the particular nutrients that leafy crops need will be taken out of the soil. The soil will become impoverished. If you put another leafy crop in the next year, they will need the same things, so the soil will start to struggle. So if you move from a leafy crop to the next year using a leguminous crop, now this is actually really, really useful because these are nitrogen fixing, so they would actually really help the soil. So the soil has enough time to kind of replenish from the things that the leafy crop has taken out, and it's just the leguminous ones that are using. And then you go to a different crop and a different crop, and it allows the soil to recover. Okay, and as you see, some of them are even increasing the quality of the soil as you go. You could go GM crops. Okay, if you think about the nitrogen cycle, anywhere where you can actually increase the amount of nitrogen that's going on, you could increase the yield, and you could also cut down the amount of fertilizer you need. And you also could go with any of the other ways that GM crops could improve your yield. Okay, that's us.